Taxi!
Where to, mate?
Hello, mate. 55 Tufton Street, please.
55 Tufton Street, SW1. Yep, I know it well. Hop in, sir. This is A Nation of Taxpayers, a weekly podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance.
On this episode, we discuss the ongoing situation in the Middle East. My name's Duncan Barkes. I'm your host. Alongside me, we have Elliot Keck from the Taxpayers Alliance. Hello again, Elliot.
Hello, Duncan.
Good to see you. And our guest this week is Jake Wallis Simons, columnist, broadcaster, foreign correspondent, and former editor of the Jewish Chronicle. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming in. The usual caveat applies when we talk about something that is quite fluid and ongoing, that we record this in SW1 on a Tuesday afternoon, so by the time you're listening to this, things might have changed a little bit, but I think the essence still remains. As we talk about what we've seen and heard in the last couple of weeks regarding the Middle East, and indeed the last couple of years, and the kind of impact it has on UK taxpayers. First off, Jake, if it's all right with you, I mean, there's been a lot of activity, a lot of bombs. What's your initial assessment of where we are currently?
I think where we are is in a much better place than the media would have us believe. The Ayatollah's regime has been humiliated, all but completely destroyed. It's lost more than half, a lot more than half of its ballistic missile stockpile, either through firing it or having it destroyed by the Israelis, up to 3/4 perhaps. It's lost more than 2/3 of its missile launchers, preventing it from launching anything that it has left. It's lost all of its air defences, pretty much, certainly in the west of the country, and of course it's lost its nuclear program, and that's something which President Trump has been insistent to drive home, that has been destroyed. Although there's been some scepticism from some quarters. Its air force is gone. All its nuclear scientists are dead. Its top brass are all dead. If I was the Ayatollah, I'd feel quite lonely at the top, having been deprived of the lower, two levels of leadership beneath me. And others are fleeing. So they have not done very well. But I think that you perhaps wouldn't get that impression from much of the media coverage, which has taken the idea of impartiality and allowed it to dominate over reporting verifiable facts. According to Iran, they're doing pretty well. According to the Israelis, they've been hammered. The truth, of course, is that they've been hammered, but so much of the mainstream media is like, well, is it not? We don't really know. So let's be totally unequivocal about this. This is Israel's war. They've won. The Americans have won. The repercussions, of course, remain to be seen, but overall, it's been a great victory.
Let's talk about the media bias for a second, and it's interesting you brought that up. I mean, Elliot, do you think where do you think who are the platforms who are most guilty of this? It's got to be the BBC, right?
It's got to be the BBC, hasn't it? I remember going back to one of the early issues around the Israel-Hamas conflict following October 7th, and there was this extraordinary battle to get the BBC to change their editorial stance so that it was all the statistics cited from Gaza were using the term the Hamas-controlled health ministry rather than just the Gaza Ministry of Health or whatever the alternative wording they were using. And we have to remember that the BBC still retains an extraordinary amount of influence over the media ecosystem. So how the BBC editorializes things and how the BBC reports things really matters, and it was this absolutely extraordinary battle to get them to start using the term Hamas-run health ministry, despite the fact that well before this point, Hamas had been banned and defined prescribed as a terrorist organisation by the UK government, of which the BBC is the state broadcaster.
Do you think, either of you, that bias is deliberate or is it somehow subconscious?
I think it's quite complicated. I don't think, having worked for the BBC myself in the past, I'd be hesitant to say that any BBC journalist goes to work in the morning thinking, you know what, I'm going to dispense with impartiality and just be biased. That might not apply. The exception to that might be the staff of BBC Arabic, many of whom don't know what impartiality is to begin with. They're not British. They're often based in the region. They don't have that tradition of democratic, transparent reporting. And that affects the BBC's coverage in its Arabic language output very deleteriously. Apart from them, I think it's not that. It's the fact that underneath their impartiality, they all hold the same opinions. And when you're trying to be impartial, but all of you think X, then X is going to filter through every time you fail.
Yeah.
And that would be true if the Daily Mail was trying to be impartial as well. It would fail towards the right. The BBC fails towards the left because most of them secretly, or not secretly, most of them, have leftist sympathies.
And I think you're spot on. I worked for the BBC as well, both domestically. I did some shifts for the World Service, but chiefly most of my work was domestically. And we talked about this regarding Brexit,
times.
haven't we? Where it's subconscious, but when you recruit from the same kind of like gene pool, if you like, or from the same kind of pod, which tends to be urbanites, metropolitan elite people, in the London area, or that incredibly well-off suburb of Manchester where most of them tend to live. What comes with that is that kind of groupthink.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a result, I think the BBC has let the public down on this issue, and has let the public down for years now. And that's really important because, one of the things that I think we're going to touch on in this episode is that, so often foreign policy and foreign affairs can feel like something that's, many thousands of miles away. And there's often a struggle to explain why it's so relevant to the public. And if you're getting these things wrong, some people either switch off or some people completely take the wrong message entirely. And, one of the most troubling things that we've seen in Britain since October 7th has been the way that the public have very much absorbed, or large parts of the public have very much absorbed this idea that this is some sort of legitimate fight between two equally legitimate actors. Yeah. And I think the role that the BBC plays in pushing that forward, the idea that actually this is just, there's some sort of moral or military or political equivalence to the two sides of this fighting, I think that has helped spread this idea across the British public, at least parts of the British public.
And I think that the two, I was going to use the term instance, but I think things have become conflated, haven't they? Because, I have a teenage daughter, actually no longer a teenager, but she gets most of her content from Instagram or TikTok, and there is... And as we all know, it's an echo chamber. And there is this narrative which is just Israel bad, right? And there's not a separation from the October the 7th attacks and the fact that you also have this regime over here called Iran who have gone on the record to say, we just want to wipe Israel off the face of the globe. That's why we want to develop a nuclear bomb. There's no nuance in there. There's no debate about those. You can argue they're related, but they are separate issues, if you like. It's just like, well, this is Israel, and they're the big bad wolf. So let's talk about social media. How much of a problem, Jake, do you think that is regarding how some of the activity and some of the issues are reported or covered?
Well, I think that without social media, we wouldn't be in this catastrophe. We saw over the weekend the deplorable spectacle of people taking to the streets, using their freedoms here to support a regime that would quash those freedoms if it could.
It's just utterly bizarre. Where does that come from? I saw those pictures and I saw the banner, be on the right side of history, I think was one of the banners. And you just go, are these people thick?
I think some of them probably are.
Yeah.
I think all of them are probably very online. And this is a regime that for anybody who looks at the world outside of their own politics and looks at the reality rather than what their own politics would have them believe for convenience sake, they would see clearly that this is a regime that it had a clock until yesterday in central Tehran, counting down to the 9th of September 2040, which is the date that Israel's destruction was prophesied by the Ayatollah, counting down.
Yeah.
This is a regime that cuts off people's hands with a circle saw if they're suspected of theft, hangs gay people from cranes and from other things, disappears people into torture chambers, into prisons. We saw one of those released by the Israelis the other day.
Flogs females if they're showing their hair or too much flesh.
I was getting to that, exactly. You'd have thought that in this day and age that would have been the most outrageous thing of all to these people who are on the streets.
You're apparently progressive and yet you're defending a regime like that.
But I think what it's taught us is that there is no evil that's so profound that it cannot be supported when it's fighting Israel.
Yeah.
That's the message from all of this. And I think that social media has a part to play because it spreads this stuff and erodes confidence. I'd rather these people took the BBC's line than took the line they're taking, frankly.
Yeah.
And I'm reminded. You talk about your daughter. My older daughter is a teenager. She's 17 now. And during the Rafah campaign, remember the hullabaloo about the supposed humanitarian crisis that was facing Rafah. There was that moment when all eyes on
Gaza,
Rafah.
probably just for our listeners, sort of in the Gaza at the border of Egypt.
Yeah, Rafah, town on the border of Egypt was distinct at the time because it was where Hamas was holed up. All of its last battalions were there. The Israelis hadn't gone in. It was also where the smuggling tunnels from Egypt go in, enabling them to pick up arms and ammunition and money and personnel. So it had to be taken if Hamas were to be defeated. And Israel was poised to go in. The world militated to stop that happening. From the media to social media to the White House, everyone said, Joe Biden said no, his famous catchphrase. Kamala Harris said there'll be a humanitarian disaster. I've looked at the map, she said, I've studied the maps. There's nowhere for these folks to go, i.e. the million civilians in Rafah. And Israel, after a 4-month pause, said, you know what, we've got to do it for strategic reasons. Those people who there was nowhere to go, they evacuated them within a week to somewhere else, went in, defeated Hamas, killed Yahya Sinwar with very few civilian casualties, game over. But the interesting point was where the social media campaign played such a big role. Because there was that meme which said, all eyes on Rafah, if you remember, with a picture of lots of tents in the desert. It was viewed, I think, 50 million times. 50 million times. And when it was going viral, it was part of a global campaign that was either joined up or not, but it was all happening at once to stop Israel from winning. And my daughter said to me at that point, she opened Instagram and said, look, I'm seeing this meme everywhere. All my friends are sharing it. Can you point me towards a pro-Israel meme to fight back with? Because I've been searching and have not been able to find one. That's the ubiquity that social media can sometimes inform ideologically on young people. And we see the results on the weekend in the street.
Yeah, and it's social media that I think is critical to this, and it's the reason why the international, and combined with high levels of immigration, the international is now domestic. So whenever there are international foreign crises, even if they're often quite isolated and far away, because we've had significant numbers of immigration, then there are generally communities from these places within the country, often quite much larger communities than they used to be. That combined with the fact that social media is pumping largely unverified, uneditorialized, unboundaried content into the sort of living rooms.
Nonsense
is a better way to put it.
Propaganda.
Or propaganda is a better way to put it. Direct to the sort of screens of 17, 18, often impressionable people, often people that should know better. It means that every time there is a foreign crisis, even if actually British interests have nothing to do with that foreign crisis, the international is made domestic. But on the case of Iran, it's actually different because, and I've got a few examples here. It's not just that Iran is unbelievably cruel and barbaric to its people. It's not that it's unbelievably cruel and barbaric and destabilizing to its neighbors. There's a whole host of testimonies to say it's incredibly destabilizing here. Just take one example, which is Ken McCallum, who's the MI5 chief, who said that Iran has been behind plot after plot in the UK over the past 2 years. Or to take another example, which was Palestine Action just recently, which we expect to be prescribed this week. The Home Office is currently probing a link to Iran there. And there's loads of other examples of this, of the way that the Iranian regime is actually causing a destabilizing influence at home. So it would be one thing if it was just, a big problem over there and a big problem for the people over there. But this directly matters to a UK taxpaying domestic audience.
But, there's this sort of double play here, because on the one hand, Iran is destabilising. You're right, Ken McCullough did mention that, I think 15 assassination or murder
that's
plots.
Right,
there's been more than that. It's about 20 a year. There was a terror attack that was foiled, mass atrocity event that was foiled just about 3 or 4 weeks ago that the Iranians were behind, that was due to be perpetrated by somebody who'd come across on a small boat into Britain. There's a journalist who was stabbed in the leg in West London. Dissidents have been threatened with guns in Glasgow by IRGC mobsters. And it's a big problem in Britain. And that is an example, as you said so eloquently, of the international becoming domestic. But in another way as well, the international, in terms of the mind of the left and the activists, the international becomes domestic, as in it's stripped of its international context and made into a domestic point. And so when they see Iran, they don't see it for what it is. They make it an expression of domestic politics. They make Gaza into an expression of domestic politics.
That's
for them,
absolutely right.
wearing the keffiyeh, flying the Iranian flag is not about actual Gaza. They know nothing about which river and which sea.
Yeah.
It's not about actual Iran. It's about their anti-establishment leftist emotion here against the establishment, against the Tories, against the government, against capitalism, and wanting to bring the whole thing down. It's really about anti-British, anti-Western sentiment, and we saw that clearly. We saw that very, very clearly when Palestine Action attacked an RAF base in the name of Gaza.
And they say, all we did was spray some red paint, and yet other reports indicate the engine that was sprayed can't be repaired. It has to be
£30 million damage.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
And also, this is really interesting because it does affect us domestically. Because now in the House of Commons we have former Labour MPs now sitting as independent MPs who, by my reckoning, pretty much got in the whole issue of the Middle East and Gaza. So it's already in the centre of our democracy, isn't it? Which nicely leads us on to this as well. Where do you guys sit with where Starmer is in all of this? How has he dealt with this? And let's start with the marches, because we've had these marches pretty much every weekend in this city of ours in a way that I don't think any other organisation would have been tolerated. So we often hear about two-tier Kia. You could argue there's an element of the two-tier tolerance that exists with these marches. So let's talk about the marches for a bit, and then the wider conduct, if you like, of our Prime Minister who's coming up to his first year in office.
Well, just today, the Telegraph reported this morning about a Jewish man who was arrested for flying an Israeli flag at a counter-demonstration against Palestine Action, who are due, so we're told, to be proscribed. And there's a video of it. The police officer said to him, look, you're going to get killed. If you're killed, that won't be very good. Therefore, I'm arresting you.
Yeah.
And the chap says, well, if I get killed, it's not my fault. It's the murderer's fault. He was like, yes, but I'm arresting you. It's insane. It's like, why don't you go around and arrest all the innocent people? Then the criminals won't be doing any crime.
There won't be any victims to be had.
Yeah, exactly. It's insane. But it says a lot about the way in which the marches have been policed week in, week out.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a number of cases like that, haven't there? There was the extraordinary case of the man that was burning the Quran. I think it was outside the Turkish embassy, was it?
Yeah.
And the reason why, one of the reasons given when he was being prosecuted, why he was being prosecuted for something that isn't a crime under UK law. We don't have blasphemy laws, but one of the reasons is that he should have known that he would be inciting a group that is often prone to violence. I mean, that was actually in the court description.
In fact, the fact that he was attacked was taken as evidence that he was the bad guy.
Exactly.
Because he'd been so awful and offensive that he'd been attacked, and therefore it's his fault.
And where I do slightly sympathise with the police is that when you look at these Palestine marches and you look at the people going on them and the messages they are flying, the police are not completely wrong to be thinking, this is a group that is likely to be extremely prone to violence because they are literally flying the flags of groups.
Well, that's why it's a mistake to let it happen in the first place.
Well, exactly. Whereas, Jake, you would have been on the pro-Israel marches, and there's, and I've been on some of the pro-Israel marches. It's a completely different atmosphere. I mean, it's and there is this sort of problem that we do have this two-tier policing, but there is a genuine operational reason
why
we have this two-tier policing.
There are two things. I mean, first off, and you're right to say you can have a degree of sympathy with the police and how they do it, because it could quite quickly turn to violence. But then we've given into the mob, haven't we?
Yeah, it's victim blaming. We are basically in victim blaming territory.
Because the other point I was going to make is it's exactly the same as just going, and forgive our audience in the studio this afternoon, it's exactly the same as going, oh, well, she wore a short skirt, so therefore somehow she was asking for it. We can't live in a country like that.
But, these marches, when they first started, I was editing the Jewish Chronicle. One of the first things we did was report upon the organisers of these marches. And almost all of the leaders of the groups organising these marches have links to Hamas.
Yeah.
A lot of them have been photographed with Hamas leaders in Gaza in the past. If these people would have felt the proper implementation of the law, and those organisations would have been treated with the robustness that they deserve, these marches would either not have happened or not in the way that they did. The fact that week in, week out, terrorist sympathisers are able to drum up some sort of rabble on our streets, sometimes codifying their language so as not to fall foul of the law explicitly, but there's no mistaking where their animus is an outrage. And most ordinary people in Britain feel that, know that, don't want it to happen, and feel very poorly served by the police and by our political leadership, who are following the letter of the law and totally ignoring the spirit of it.
Yeah, and I live in Paddington in central London, and whenever you have these marches, it's not just the impact of the march itself. That march does is it pulls in police from all over London.
Yeah.
So suddenly the police presence in local neighbourhoods around the capital, which is already a place with serious crime problems, that police presence suddenly drops significantly. And if you are victim to a crime, you do face much longer waits.
And it's not just that. In order to police these marches, you're going to have to do overtime and stuff to get the officers there, etc. So it's costing the taxpayer
around the country.
money.
They're pulled from around the country.
For the big ones, of course they do.
It's cost millions and millions.
Yeah. Just a slightly wider view on Keir Starmer. I mean, over the weekend, I thought it was it a fudge? It was a very carefully worded statement in response to the American bombing of Tehran, very much focusing on Iran cannot be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. Should he have gone further and condemned Iran?
Well, what I find really frustrating about this use of the term that, the British government's position is that Iran should not have a nuclear weapon, is that if you're not willing to back that up with the use of military force to stop them from getting a nuclear weapon, it's a completely redundant and irrelevant statement. And, it'd be one thing if it's a country that doesn't have the military capabilities to contribute to taking out that that nuclear program. For example, if Malta or something like that, I'm sure Malta's government position is that Iran shouldn't have a nuclear weapon, but at the same time they don't have the military capabilities to enforce that. We do, not to do it ourselves, but we certainly have the military capabilities to assist. Yeah. And yet the British government has been not only has it been coy about whether or not it would contribute, we have legal advice from the Attorney General suggesting that actually we can't even offer Diego Garcia to the Americans because it could potentially be illegal. Yeah. So I think Starmer needs to remind himself that the national interest and international law are not necessarily the same thing. And where they're not the same thing, national interest should trump international law every time.
Jake, your thoughts on Keir Starmer's leadership or lack of it over this?
Well, look, this is the nation of Winston Churchill. This is the nation of Winston Churchill, and we're led by Keir Starmer at wartime. In a parallel universe, if we were led by a proper prime minister, he would have banned the IRGC, Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, from Britain, who have been plotting terror attacks here. He would have supported Israel properly, vocally, and substantially since October the 7th. With military support as well as rhetorical support. And when Israel attacked Iran, he would have supported those strikes, he would have endorsed those strikes, he would have dispatched the RAF to defend Israel's skies, and possibly even to strike within Iran at missile launchers to defend Israel's population from those. He would have vocally supported the United States, and rather than de-escalation, he would have talked of victory. Yeah. Because these are our jihadi enemies who would have us all dead if they could. Israel is doing our dirty work for us. The people of Israel have backed this war by 90%, even though they know that civilians are going to die. A world-leading cancer research unit in Israel has been destroyed by an Iranian missile. A hospital has been destroyed by an Iranian missile. About 35 people have been killed, including 4 or 5 overnight in Beersheba, including a Holocaust survivor who's 95, who was killed by an Iranian missile. But the Israeli people understand what's at stake, and they're willing to put themselves behind this effort to rid themselves of a nuclear threat, and in so doing, rid us of the nuclear threat. Israeli intelligence has revealed that Iran's plan was to produce small nuclear bombs and hand them out to terrorist groups. Now, if one of those didn't have London in its crosshairs, I would be very, very surprised indeed. We should have been talking about victory, not de-escalation. All the government can say on matters of war and peace is one word, de-escalation, and they should be saying victory.
So why is it so weak? Is he protecting his core vote? Does he just simply lack the ability to lead like a wartime leader? What's driving it?
Well, I think the sort of immediate political considerations obviously are about his Muslim base, which he's very concerned about and has been edging the government towards increasing hostility to Israel with each passing month recently in a desperate effort to shore up the hemorrhaging to the Gaza independence and so on and so forth. That's one part of the story. But I think the greater part of the story is just that he's a coward. And the reason he's a coward, like all of our elite leadership class, is because we live in what Simon Sebag Montefiore has called a comfort democracies. We've had no threat of war on our own shores in living memory, and we've forgotten what it means to have to stand up and fight for your values and for your way of life and for what's right. And he's more concerned with domestic politics, with whether
the winter fuel payment,
winter fuel allowance, and which pronouns are allowed, and how many of the elderly can you kill at once, and that sort of stuff, while ignoring the threat to our civilization. It's totally myopic, and I'm afraid that what he doesn't realise, and people like him don't realise, is that their time has gone. They're the walking dead. The population has turned on them. We know. The amount of support for reform now shows that people have seen through that, what I call the centrist fundamentalist class. They're gone. This century belongs with Israel and with the United States, with countries who stand up for their values and have the resilience in their population and the conviction to do so, who know who they are and are willing to fight for it. If we don't wise up and join them, as the population, as the people want, it's going to be very messy indeed.
That's exactly my assessment of why Reform are doing so well at the moment. It's taken me a few months to actually reach that conclusion, but that's bang on. Listen, a few minutes left of this particular episode. Something that's just dropped online is a poll that's been done by YouGov on behalf of the New Statesman. So, bear in mind who the commissioner is, if you like. I just like your reaction to this, given everything that we just talked about over the last half an hour. Would you support or oppose the United Kingdom helping to defend Israel by assisting in the shooting down of missiles and drones from Iran? Support 25%, unsure 26%, oppose 49%. Is that a surprise to you, Elliot?
I often find, polling that asks people sort of their instinctive gut reaction on an issue of this sort of significance and complexity and difficulty, I'm always very sceptical of. Because a lot of people will just hear in that polling question military activity. All they'll hear is British military forces being used abroad. They won't actually get into the detail. And so they'll just instinctively react in a way that's hostile.
So there's a default setting of like,
exactly.
No war.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm very sceptical, and I think, there's probably an argument that politicians use polling way too much on every single issue. But if there's this one issue that we should definitely not be using polling to inform, it's British foreign policy. Because that needs to take a very, very long-term 10, 20, 30, 40, 50-year view, which a poll of 2,000 representative adults between June the 10th and June the 14th is absolutely useless for.
And you're right, politicians do rely remarkably heavily on polling. So if Keir Starmer sees this, Jake, he's going to go, made the right decision not to get too involved.
Yeah, Elliot, you're absolutely right. But I think there's something deeper going on here as well, which is that people think and often express the views that they feel that they're allowed to express or they should express.
Yes,
And so...
if you hear it's YouGov.
And polling is often a snapshot, not necessarily of something that's immovable in the British people, but more the prevailing cultural sentiments of the time and what's permitted. And, we're living in a time where 48% of people, young people, would not fight to defend Britain under any circumstances, according to a recent poll. But these things would change. If we lived in a time where proper political leadership was being shown that allowed us to feel free to express pride in our country, pride in our values, conviction in our identity, and generosity towards outsiders, but not at the expense of ourselves. If that was the prevailing cultural norm, I think that these polls would be reversed because people would be free to express what deep down they really think. And so I think that what we need overall is a cultural renewal, which I think is coming. And it will require people in all walks of life standing up and throwing off the fear of being able to say what they feel. And standing up against that collective taboo and leading other people with them. And I think that, combined with political change, will lead us to a social renewal that will bring us back to ourselves. Yeah,
it's what you might call the Grenfell effect, I suppose, which was that before Grenfell, we knew, loads of people knew for years and years and years there was this huge problem with flammable cladding. And yet it actually took Grenfell for people to suddenly think, we actually need to do something about this. And on Jake's point about, Iranian plans to use small nuclear weapons in various cities around the world, imagine if one of those did actually take place and, take the polling after that took place. But unfortunately, without proper political leadership, political leaders often wait for a Grenfell to happen
Yeah.
before they actually think, now I'm going to make the change, rather than leading from the front. They often follow crises as they happen, and that is obviously a dereliction of duty from our current class of political leaders, unfortunately.
I think that's a really shrewd observation. Jake, listen, thank you for coming in. It's been a really interesting chat. People can find out more about you online. I think there's a Substack, is that right?
There is a Substack under my name. Yeah, they can catch me on Twitter if they want to. My latest book is called Israelophobia, the newest version of the oldest hatred and what to do about it. I've got a new book which is called Never Again ? How the West Betrayed the Jews and Itself, which is coming out in October.
Jake, thank you for coming in. Jake Wallis Simons, and Elliot, as always, thank you for participating on this episode. This has been A Nation of Taxpayers. It's the podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and on YouTube. Do like us and follow us and help spread the word. And of course, you can get in contact by sending an email. The email address is podcast@taxpayersalliance.com.